It was a bitter struggle against the land and water to gain supremacy over Asia. By this point, the United States had been provoked into fighting the Pacific War with Japan. The Second World War had now engulfed the entire planet. And the two naval titans opposed each other aboard the world's largest ocean, exchanging blows that were unprecedented at the time. Was in a race to bring their troops and supplies thousands of kilometers closer in a desperate bid to reclaim Japanese-occupied Asia. This was a fight for every island, and although airplanes would prove most crucial to the fight at the time, it was the blood of the men on the ground that was shed in the fight for victory, not only on the beaches, but also in the jungle. December 7, 1941, American radio stations broke that evening's programming with a special report. Japan had launched an unprovoked attack on the United States at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, where the American military operated a base, and the Second World War entered a new phase. Japan had been inducted into Hitler's tripartite pact and was facing a barrage of economic sanctions. War with the U.S. was inevitable, and the military leadership in Tokyo viewed the American enclave in the Pacific Ocean as a dagger to its throat. In 1940, the U.S. had relocated its Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor, where a Japanese admiral named Isuruku Yamamoto set out to destroy it on Sunday, 7th December, 1941. A special combat unit under the command of Yamamoto arrived at the target point of its attack at 6 a.m. The 6 Japanese aircraft carriers turned into the wind and launched its aircraft. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighter planes, just after sunrise, bearing directly down on the base in Hawaii. Just as it awoke at 7:48 a.m., the first communication to Japanese leaders was confirmed. Tora, 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 the order code, signifying a successful surprise attack. All 8 of the standing Pacific Fleet's battleships were moored in a double line along an island called Ford, a perfect target, and 2 waves of attacks numbered approximately 350 planes. If the count in the last remnants looked like they made up the ground, the first wave of attack was finished. All of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleships were either at the bottom of the harbor or in about to be. So the other 3 battleships, a cruiser, and numerous destroyers bore heavy damage. The Japanese had also written off 188 American planes across the Hickam and Wheeler Air Force bases. Loosed in the engagement, 29 of the Japanese aircraft were downed in the attack. And anchoring at over Hawaiian Naval Base, the majority of U.S. Pacific Fleet had been wiped out, and over 2,400 of the U.S. soldiers were dead. Now America was at war. But the attack hadn't been simply to lure the United States into war, so as to liberate them, as some claimed the empire was reliant on oil and other raw materials, which meant that it had to conquer then uncharted territory that lay within its horizon. To that end, the empire began to expand, and the U.S., led by Roosevelt, attempted to stop that expansion either through economic sanctions and finally an oil embargo. But the attack's effectiveness at first glance was a massive success. But not so much when you realize that none of America's aircraft carriers had been at that naval base at the time. That's because both the Enterprise and the Lexington were both entrusted with delivering planes to and from American territories on the islands of Midway and Wake, and so had been spared the attack at that point in 1941. Aircraft carriers were a relatively new fighting weapon. Previously, battleships were believed to be the ultimate rulers of the sea, but this weapon of domination of the ocean proved absolutely to be defenseless against relatively cheap planes. The assault on Pearl Harbor had effectively turned the U.S. fleet of battleships in a fleet of carriers, a tactical and a strategic revolution, with far-reaching implications for the future U.S. president of the day. Roosevelt famously described December 7th as a date which will live in infamy. 2 days later, December 8th, 1941, the U.S. declared war on Japan, and even if Hitler had had absolutely no choice but to announce that Germany was now at war with the U.S., the Second World War had become a global inferno. Japan already on a military campaign for the better part of those 10 years previous in Manchuria. China and the Pacific at that time desired to extend the reach of her imperial ambitions, but to do so, she needed access to natural resources and at any cost. And so the attack on the U.S. amassed was meant to buy Japan some more time to conquer land and thus secure their superiority over all of their neighbors. While the attack on Pearl Harbor was taking place, Tenno soldiers were pushing Americans from the Central Pacific at an island known as Wake Island and seizing Dutch-controlled Indonesia from the Dutch. The land of the rising sun was engaged in an unmerciful war of conquest, and had it appeared at the time that no one could stand it. By the spring of 1942, the Dominion had extended. It was the zenith of the Japanese Empire, the point where it might having unchallenged domination of the whole Far East at the expense of its European colonial masters. In just a few weeks, the Japanese had conquered Tai Hong Kong and Singapore, and then after that, North Borneo, Indonesia, and the Philippines were the next to give up under the onslaught where Emperor Hirohito's soldiers rampaged through the Pacific like a typhoon in the months after Pearl Harbor. "I shall return," had promised the U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, when on March 12, 1942, he was forced to abandon the Philippines. In May, the residual U.S. soldiers laid down their arms. Thousands of them died en route to prison. The only other option was to go on the defensive President Roosevelt had needed to exhibit power, and the Americans replied to the challenge by sketching out an unorthodox plan. They were about to strike the enemy where it would hurt the worst. Tokyo, the capital of the emperor, the son of heaven, would soon feel their anger up close and personal. The U.S. aircraft carrier Hornet set out for Japan on the 2nd of April 1942. 16 B-25 bombers were strapped down to the deck. It turns out that the U.S. Army's aircraft weren't outfitted for taking off from aircraft carriers returning to their ships, and landing on deck was out of the question. So a flight to China was scheduled for. After the bombings, the attack plan was drawn and executed by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, and his name went down in history for what became known as the Doolittle Raid en route. The Hornet met the aircraft carrier Enterprise, which led Task Force 16 to escort Doolittle and his planes on board the Hornet. The crew awaited their deployment. They tied old friendship medals that had been given to them by the Japanese to their bombs as a form of greeting. After Pearl Harbor, there was no longer any hope of friendship ever since the day of the attack. On the 18th of April, the fleet encountered Japanese forward post ships. Several of these little ships the Americans sank, but they couldn't stop them from transmitting radio signals the U.S. unit had been discovered, and Doolittle and Mark Michener. The Hornet's commander made the decision to launch the bombers immediately. The first B-25 was piloted by James Doolittle and took off 10 hours earlier than the original plan had stated, directed towards Tokyo. All crew members volunteered, and they were aware of what this unplanned takeoff indicated. The fuel was insufficient to reach the territories in China without occupation. By the Japanese, the coup became a success. Bombs fell on Tokyo. Most of the bombers' crews were able to get to the region not controlled by the Japanese after the assault, and as a result, headed back to the U.S. 2 men drowned during an emergency landing on the water. 8 U.S. men were sent to the prison in Japan, 3 of whom were put to death. Japan's leaders were devastated. The U.S. Pacific Fleet looked more dangerous than ever.